My brother stole my wife 4 years ago, but my dad's revelation shattered his life. You won't believe what happens when a family's darkest secret comes to light. Imagine being betrayed by the people you loved most, your own brother and wife. This shocking twist will leave you speechless. Stay tuned to find out how it all unravels, and who truly pays the price in the end. The moment the phone rang, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't the usual greeting from my father, the calm, reassuring tone that I had always relied on. No, this time it was sharp, cold, and direct. I had heard that tone only a handful of times before, and each time it had signaled something serious, something that would change everything. His words hit like a gut punch. We're having a family meeting tomorrow. Your brother will be there too. I gripped the phone harder, the weight of his words sinking deep into my stomach. My brother. The one who had destroyed everything I held dear 4 years ago. The man who stole my wife. The one who had torn my life apart. I hadn't seen him since that night, the night I walked out of our family home, vowing never to speak to him again. For 4 years, I buried myself in work, rebuilding what was left of my shattered existence. I told myself I had moved on. I told myself that I didn't care anymore. I had forced myself to believe it. I was fine. I had rebuilt my life piece by piece. But my father's words, they told me otherwise. The truth was, I wasn't fine. I was far from fine. Deep down, I knew that avoiding this meeting wouldn't be an option. No matter how much I wanted to. I had to go. There was no way out. I didn't respond right away. My fingers hovered over the phone, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Part of me wanted to make an excuse, to tell him I had something else to do. Anything to avoid facing them. But I knew I couldn't. So, with a sigh, I forced myself to respond, my voice tight. I'll be there. The next day, I found myself driving toward my father's house, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't been here in years. The long driveway stretched out before me, and I could feel every bump in the road as I drove past the familiar landscape. The place where my brother and I used to race our bikes, laughing as we sped down the winding path. The porch where I once stood with my wife, holding her in my arms, believing that our future was as unbreakable as the love we shared. The front door that I had slammed shut when I left, vowing never to return. And now, here I was again, walking through it all. I stepped inside, my nerves on edge. The familiar scent of my father's cigars hit me immediately, mingled with a faint trace of my mother's lavender perfume. A reminder of the woman who had been the glue holding us all together. She'd been gone for years, but her presence still lingered in every corner of this house. And then, as I entered the living room, I saw them. My brother, lounging in his chair, his arm draped casually over the side, his smug grin still as irritating as ever. He was dressed in the same perfectly pressed shirt, his hair styled just right, wearing a watch that probably cost more than my entire monthly salary. The golden child, always the favorite, always the one who could do no wrong. Except for the fact that he had stolen everything from me. He had stolen my wife. He had stolen my future. And there she was. Sophie, my ex-wife. Sitting next to him, acting like nothing had ever happened. She looked at me the way a cat looks at its prey, amused, relaxed, confident that I wasn't a threat. Her eyes scanned me up and down, and then she smiled. The same cruel smile that had haunted me for years. "Hey, ugly," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Still the same. My jaw clenched, but I stayed silent. For years, I had prepared for this moment. I had convinced myself that if I ever saw them again, I wouldn't let them get to me. I had told myself that I was over it, that I had grown beyond their petty jabs. But standing here now, seeing their faces, hearing their voices, it was like no time had passed at all. I felt the anger and betrayal come rushing back, threatening to overwhelm me, but I wouldn't let them see it. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Before I could say anything, my father stood up, and the room fell into silence. When he spoke, it was like his voice had the weight of 1,000 years behind it. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His presence alone was enough. "Good timing," he said, his gaze shifting between my brother and me. I saw it then, the shift in my brother's expression. For the first time, I saw something like fear flicker in his eyes. Sophie's smugness faded as she sat up straighter in her chair, her fingers curling slightly around the armrest. They weren't expecting this. And then I knew. This wasn't just some family meeting. It wasn't just a casual conversation. It was something more. My father turned and walked toward his desk, pulling out a thick envelope and setting it down on the table between us. "This is my will," he said, his voice steady, but there was an undertone of finality. The air in the room changed instantly. I could feel it pressing down on all of us, thick and heavy. My brother's smirk faltered, replaced by something else, something uncertain. Sophie's posture stiffened. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. For the first time since I'd walked into the house, she didn't look so confident. My father continued, his gaze never leaving my brother. "There's something you need to understand," he said. His voice was calm but firm, and I could tell my brother wasn't ready for what was coming. "I built this family's wealth from nothing. I sacrificed. I worked. I bled to make sure you both had everything you needed. But there's a difference between needing something and feeling entitled to it." The room was suffocatingly silent. My brother let out a small, forced laugh, but I could see the tension in his face. He wasn't used to being shut down. He had always been the one who manipulated situations to make himself look like the victim. But not this time. Not now. "You betrayed your own blood," my father continued, his voice growing sharper. "You humiliated your brother. You took what wasn't yours, and you did it with a smile on your face." My brother's smirk faltered even further. His confidence was slipping, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as I watched him squirm. This was just the beginning. The silence in the room was suffocating. For a long moment, no one moved. My father's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, their weight pressing down on everyone in the room. Grayson's smirk had completely disappeared, replaced by a look of uncertainty and discomfort. Sophie, who had once looked at me with nothing but disdain, now seemed uneasy, her fingers tapping nervously on the armrest of her chair. It was a sight I had never expected to see. My brother, the one who had always been the golden child, the one who had always gotten away with everything, was now visibly rattled. And Sophie, the woman who had once been my partner, my confidant, was just as lost as he was. It felt like everything I had endured over the last 4 years was suddenly coming to a head. I had been waiting for this moment for so long, but now that it was finally here, the realization that things were about to change was almost too much to bear. My father, unflinching in his composure, walked to the desk, his slow, deliberate steps echoing in the silence. The thick envelope he placed on the table between us felt like it could crush everything that had come before it. It was as though the entire room had been holding its breath, waiting for the final revelation. This was it, the moment I had dreamed of and dreaded in equal measure. I had spent years convincing myself that I didn't care, that I had moved on, that I was stronger than the betrayal. But now, looking at my brother and ex-wife, seeing their discomfort, hearing my father's steady, unwavering voice, I realized I was nowhere near as detached as I had pretended to be. Grayson, still sitting in his chair, began to squirm. His usual arrogance, the smugness that had always defined him, was crumbling before my eyes. I had always known that he saw himself as the better son, the one who could do no wrong in my father's eyes, the one who could always manipulate situations to his advantage. But now, for the first time in years, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The cracks were starting to show. And Sophie, God. Sophie, she wasn't even trying to hide her anxiety anymore. The woman who had once looked at me like I was beneath her now looked small, unsure, vulnerable. There was no pretension left, no bravado, just fear. The power in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight change in my father's posture, the way he leaned forward just a little, the calm authority in his voice that made even the air around us feel heavy. "This is my will," he said, his voice low but firm, carrying with it the kind of finality that made every word feel like a judgment. The words landed like a hammer, ringing out in the silence. My brother's eyes widened, and I saw the first genuine flicker of panic cross his face. Sophie sat up straighter, her body language shifting from casual to rigid, as though she could feel the ground beneath her slipping away. The smug confidence that had once been her trademark was gone, replaced by something colder, something that screamed desperation. They weren't expecting this. They weren't ready for what was coming. "Why are we talking about this now, Dad?" Grayson asked, his voice tentative, his usual swagger nowhere to be found. It was as if he knew deep down that the game had changed, that everything he thought was his was now in question. My father didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for the envelope and placed it squarely in the center of the table. The sharp sound of paper against wood cut through the room, like a final declaration. Every eye in the room was fixed on it. And in that moment, I realized how much of my life had led up to this. I had been waiting for a reckoning, for justice, for the truth to come to light. And now, it was happening. It wasn't a question of if this was the moment that everything changed. Grayson's expression faltered as he leaned forward slightly, his eyes flicking between the envelope and my father. "Why now?" he repeated, his voice edging toward defensiveness. But my father was having none of it. "Because I don't have time to waste," he said, his tone still even but filled with an undercurrent of something colder, something more final. And that was when it hit me. My father had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together, who made the hard decisions. He had always been the pillar of the family, the one who kept us all in line. But now, I saw it clearly. There was something wrong. His once strong frame looked thinner, his skin paler. The lines on his face, which had always been sharp and defined, now looked deeper, etched by a weight he had carried for too long. It wasn't just the weight of his age or the wear of years. It was something more, something serious. Then came the words that shattered the tension in the room. "I have terminal cancer," my father said, his voice unbroken, but the words landed like a slap. 3 months left. The room went still. The air seemed to freeze, and I felt my stomach drop into my shoes. 3 months. The finality of those words was suffocating. It wasn't just the news of his illness. It was the fact that everything had just changed. For years, I had been angry, bitter, consumed by the betrayal that my brother and Sophie had inflicted on me. I had lived in that anger, letting it define me. But now I was forced to confront the truth. My father, the man who had always been the rock, was dying. And suddenly, none of it seemed as important anymore. The past, the betrayal, the bitterness, everything fell away, leaving only the raw reality of what was happening. Grayson's face drained of color. His mouth hung open slightly, but no words came out. He looked lost, like he didn't know how to process the words that had just come from our father. Sophie, ever the picture of control, had lost that too. Her eyes darted between my father and me, her face contorted in disbelief. But she didn't seem sad, or grieving. No. What I saw in her eyes was fear. Fear of what was to come. Fear of what my father's decision meant for her and Grayson. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I just sat there, my heart racing in my chest, trying to process what my father had just said. The man who had always been so strong, so certain, was now admitting that he had only a fraction of the time left. 3 months. And in those 3 months, everything was going to change. The wealth, the property, the legacy, everything would be up for grabs. "I built this family's wealth from nothing," my father continued, his voice still steady. But there was an undeniable edge to it now. "I worked. I bled to make sure you both had everything you needed. But there's a difference between needing something and feeling entitled to it." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The finality in his tone, the way he looked at Grayson, made it clear. This wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about family, about loyalty. And Grayson had failed every test. Sophie's voice cut through the tension, sharp and defensive. "What do you mean, Dad?" Her question was laced with anxiety, but she tried to mask it with that same arrogance that had always defined her. "What are you trying to say?" But my father didn't waver. "You don't deserve a damn thing," he said, his voice cold and final. The room seemed to hold its breath. Grayson's face twisted with confusion and anger, his arrogance returning. But I could see it, a flicker of panic in his eyes. He wasn't the golden boy anymore. He wasn't the one in control. My father leaned forward, his gaze never leaving my brother's face. "You betrayed your own blood," he said slowly, deliberately. "You humiliated your brother. You took what wasn't yours, and you did it with a smile on your face." The words were like a sharp slap, a reminder of everything Grayson had done to me, to us. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of satisfaction. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The reckoning. And Grayson knew it. The silence in the room was deafening. It was a silence that spoke volumes. Grayson's smirk faltered, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He didn't have a response. He couldn't. This was bigger than him. And now, For the first time in his life, he was going to have to face the consequences of his actions. Wait a second. Just when you think everything is falling apart for him, what happens next? Completely flips the script. Do you think he'll finally get the revenge he deserves? Comment below. Do you think Grayson and Sophie will get what's coming to them? Comment 1 for justice, comment 2 for a shocking twist. You have 10 seconds to comment. Start nows. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you for taking the time to comment. Now, let's dive back into this thrilling story. The room was suffocating with tension, each passing second feeling like an eternity. My father's words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, like a damning judgment that would change everything. Grayson's smug, confident demeanor was completely gone, replaced by the first genuine expression of uncertainty I'd ever seen on his face. He leaned forward, his hands resting tensely on the table, eyes flickering between my father, Sophie, and me. It was clear he was no longer in control of the situation, and the realization was settling in like a lead weight. Sophie, the woman who had once been so poised, so sure of herself, had become visibly uneasy. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, eyes darting around the room, never quite landing on anyone. She too felt the shift. She knew this wasn't just a conversation anymore, this was the moment everything would change. I could almost feel the shift in the air, the way it became thicker, charged with the weight of everything that had been hidden for years. My mind raced, recalling everything that had led us to this point. My father's unwavering work ethic, the sacrifices he had made, the dreams he had built, and all the years I had spent watching my brother slowly slip from the golden child to the one who had taken everything from me. The man who had stolen my wife, my life, and now was about to lose it all. I had spent so many years swallowed up by bitterness, consumed by the hatred I had for him, but now, in this moment, I was witnessing the unraveling of everything he had built. His arrogance, his selfishness, his greed, all of it was crumbling right before my eyes. My father didn't look at Grayson with the disdain that I felt. He didn't need to. His gaze was steady, unwavering, like a man who had seen through all the pretenses and lies. You think you're entitled to everything I've built, my father said, his voice steady and deliberate. But you're wrong. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had been buried for years. Grayson, who had always thought he was untouchable, who had always gotten what he wanted by using others, was now faced with the harsh truth. He wasn't entitled to any of it. None of it. The shift in his expression was almost imperceptible. At first a slight twitch in his jaw, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But then, the reality of what was happening hit him. The mask of arrogance that had been so carefully crafted over the years cracked. His face grew pale, and for the first time in a long time, he seemed small, like the little brother I used to protect when we were children. The tables had turned, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He looked to Sophie, his eyes begging for some kind of support, some kind of explanation. But she was silent. She knew, just as well as I did, that there was no way out. The truth had been laid bare, and there was nothing left to hide behind. My father's gaze never wavered. I built this family's legacy with my own 2 hands. He continued, his voice unwavering. I didn't ask for help. I didn't take shortcuts. I did it for you too. He paused, letting the words hang in the air for a moment before adding, but I won't let you destroy it. Not like this. Sophie shifted uncomfortably again. I could see the panic rising in her eyes. She wasn't worried about my father. No. She was worried about the consequences of everything coming to light. She knew that with my father's will on the table, everything was about to change. It was no longer about me or Grayson, it was about what my father had created and what he was about to give away. And that terrified her. She had built her life on the idea that my father would always be there, that his wealth and power would always protect them. But now, everything was on the line. Grayson finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. This is ridiculous, he said, his words tinged with disbelief. You can't do this. You can't just take everything away from me. His words were defensive, desperate, as though he were trying to will the situation back into his control. But he was too late. There was no going back. My father had already made his decision, and there was nothing Grayson could do to change it. The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel the heat rising in my chest. The anger and frustration I had carried for years threatening to spill over. I wanted to lash out, to scream at him for what he had done to me, to us. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, watching him unravel, watching him lose everything he had worked so hard to steal. And then, my father spoke again, his voice calm but with an edge of finality. "You don't deserve anything," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "Not after what you've done, not after the lies you've told, the people you've hurt. You have no right to what I've built." For a moment, Grayson's face went completely blank. His expression was unreadable, like he was trying to process the weight of what had just been said. But then, his anger flared again. "You're just going to let him have everything?" he spat, pointing at me. "He's the one who lost it all. He's the one who got cheated on." His voice was rising now, the desperation clear. "You're just going to give him everything while I get nothing? You're going to do this to your own son?" The accusation hung in the air, thick with bitterness and resentment. It was a question that I had asked myself countless times over the years. Why had my father chosen me? Why had he given me everything when Grayson had betrayed him so thoroughly? I had never understood it. But now, in this moment, I didn't need to. My father had made his choice, and there was no going back. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as I watched my brother unravel. For years, he had lived in a world where he could do no wrong, where everything had been handed to him on a silver platter. But now, that world was crumbling. And it wasn't just me who had watched him fall. It was everyone who had ever believed in him. The mask had come off, and all that was left was a man who had betrayed his family, his brother, and the woman who had once been by his side. Sophie's voice broke the silence again, but this time, there was no mocking tone, no arrogance. There was only fear. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice trembling. "You're really going to throw us out? You're going to leave us with nothing?" She was desperate now, clutching at Grayson's arm like a lifeline. But even he didn't have the power to save her anymore. My father didn't even flinch. "You've already thrown yourselves away," he said simply. "Now you'll live with the consequences." Grayson's face twisted in anger, but underneath it, I could see the panic creeping in. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in, and it was too much for him to bear. He had always believed that he was invincible. But now, standing there in front of my father, facing the consequences of his actions, he realized just how wrong he had been. It was over. There was no more pretending. No more manipulation. No more games. The past had caught up with him, and it was time for him to face the music. The air was thick with the weight of my father's words, each one a reminder of how everything had gone wrong. It felt like a dam had finally burst, the floodgates opened, and now the truth was spilling out uncontrollably. My brother, Grayson, was visibly unraveling in front of us, his once manicured exterior starting to crack. The anger was still there, simmering just below the surface, but now, it was tinged with something else: fear. Sophie, too, seemed to feel the ground shift beneath her. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. The arrogance that had once defined her was gone, replaced by a quiet, desperate calculation. She was starting to realize that the world they had built, the life they had carefully crafted from lies and manipulation, was crumbling around them. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. My father, always the pillar of strength, stood like a man who had already made peace with what was to come. His face was stern, resolute. There was no anger in his eyes, just the cold clarity of someone who knew that the truth was the only thing left to deal with. He had spent his life building a legacy, a life that Grayson and Sophie had tried to tear apart with their betrayal. And now, my father was taking control again. For once, he wasn't asking for anyone's approval. This was his final act, and it was going to be done his way. "You think you can just take whatever you want, Grayson?" My father's voice was steady, but there was a bite to it now. Something that made the words cut even deeper. Grayson flinched, his gaze snapping toward our father. The arrogance he had worn like armor for so long was starting to disintegrate. I could see it in his eyes. He didn't know what to do with himself anymore. For the first time in years, Grayson was facing the consequences of his actions, and he couldn't hide behind his charm or his wealth. The reality was finally hitting him. Everything he had stolen, everything he had taken from me, was coming back to haunt him. Sophie opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't say anything that would change the course of this. No amount of pleading, no amount of excuses, could fix what was broken. My father's gaze was unwavering, his eyes cold and sharp. He had made his decision, and nothing would change that. I worked my entire life to build something for this family, my father continued, his voice growing stronger, more assertive. You, Grayson, you took it all for granted. You used your charm and your lies to manipulate everyone around you. And Sophie, he turned to her, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it regret? Fear? It was hard to say, but it was there, hidden behind the mask she had carefully crafted for so long. You've stood by, watching it all happen, taking what wasn't yours. You think you deserve something because you've been living off of my blood, sweat, and tears. No, you don't. The silence that followed was deafening. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the weight of the years I had spent nursing this anger, this hurt. It had always been about the betrayal, the lies, the way they had both taken everything from me. But now, it wasn't just about that anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about justice. It was about watching my brother and Sophie finally face what they had done. They could no longer pretend that everything they had was theirs. The truth had come crashing down, and it was impossible to ignore. Grayson's face twisted in anger, his jaw clenching as he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is ridiculous, he spat, his voice rising. You can't just take everything and give it to him. His finger jabbed in my direction, the accusation clear in his eyes. He lost it all. He doesn't deserve any of it. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't flinch. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about him. This was about him being forced to finally answer for everything he had done. I had spent years wondering why it all had to happen this way. Why he had taken what wasn't his. Why Sophie had been so willing to betray me, to turn her back on everything we had built together. But now, as I sat there, watching him squirm, the answers didn't matter anymore. I didn't care about his excuses, his anger, or his desperation. It was too late for that. I had already moved on. I was no longer the one bound by the pain of the past. That person, the one who had been consumed by betrayal, was gone. You think you can just walk in here and act like you're entitled to something you've never worked for? My father's voice was sharp now, cutting through Grayson's words with the precision of a blade. You've destroyed everything, Grayson. You've destroyed your family. You've destroyed my trust. And you've destroyed your own future. All because you couldn't control your greed. Sophie's eyes were wide now, darting from my father to Grayson, her body stiff and tense. She had always been the one who had gotten what she wanted, always been the one who had used her charm to manipulate the situation. But now, I saw it in her eyes, the fear. She knew what was coming. She knew that she, too, would lose everything. The life she had built on lies, on manipulation, was about to crumble around her. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable. She was beginning to understand that there was no way out. Grayson took a step back, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had always been the one in control, the one who had been handed everything without ever having to work for it. And now, in this moment, he realized just how fragile everything was. Everything he thought he could take for granted was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The truth was bigger than his charm, bigger than his manipulative tactics. It was bigger than him. Dad, come on, Grayson muttered, his voice hoarse. This isn't fair. You're just going to leave me with nothing? His eyes flicked to me, a pleading look crossing his face. But I didn't say anything. What was there left to say? He had made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. There was no sympathy left in me. There was no part of me that cared anymore. I had been the one left broken. The one left to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. And now, he was going to face it. Sophie's voice broke the silence once more, but this time, it was shaky, uncertain. You can't do this, Her words trailed off as she realized that there was nothing left for them. My father's gaze was steady, unwavering. He didn't need to say anything more. The decision had been made. There was no going back. Grayson turned away, his back stiff, his shoulders tense with the weight of everything that had just been said. But I saw it, he was broken. The mask was gone. The perfect image he had spent years building. The life of luxury and entitlement had come crashing down around him, and there was no one left to catch him. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The weight of the moment was crushing, pressing down on us all. Grayson was standing now, but there was no fire in his eyes, no clever words to save him. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by the kind of tension that came from realizing that all his manipulations, all the years he had spent weaving his lies, had finally caught up to him. He had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable, the golden child who could never fall. But now, in the presence of my father, in the face of the undeniable truth, Grayson was unraveling before our very eyes. Sophie, ever the opportunist, shifted in her seat. Her face, once so sure and confident, was now tight with panic. She had always been able to control the narrative, to charm her way out of any situation. But now, with every word that came from my father, with every piece of evidence laid out in front of her, that control was slipping away. My father had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, every word carried weight. I had seen it in his dealings, in the way he carried himself, in the way people respected him. He didn't need to shout or plead. His presence alone demanded attention. And now, as he spoke about what Grayson had done, about the legacy he had built, I could feel the room shift even further. This wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about who would get what after my father was gone. This was about respect, about loyalty, about the fabric of a family that had been torn apart by greed and betrayal. Grayson had thought he could walk into this room and still control the situation. But my father wasn't having it. The truth had already been laid bare, and in that moment, it wasn't just Grayson's future that was on the line. It was Sophie's too. Her silence spoke volumes, a stark contrast to the woman I had once known, the woman who had used every ounce of charm to secure her place in my life, in my family's wealth. Do you really think you can just erase everything you've done? My father's voice was steady, cold. You think you can betray your brother, take everything you wanted, and walk away unscathed? No, Grayson, you don't get to do that. The words were simple, but they hit like a hammer. Grayson's face twisted in anger, but it was different this time. There was no confidence behind it, no defiance. Just the raw sting of someone who had been caught, who had finally been exposed for who he truly was. I could see it in the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers curled into fists. He was desperate. And desperation made people dangerous, but it also made them vulnerable. Sophie, still sitting beside him, shot a quick glance at Grayson. I saw the way her fingers trembled as they gripped the armrest. The woman who had once been so confident, so sure of herself, was now reduced to someone clinging to a man who had no more power, no more control. She had bet on the wrong horse, and now, the reality was sinking in. Grayson wasn't the man he used to be. He was broken, and there was nothing she could do to fix it. Is this how you wanted it? My father asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. To tear this family apart for your own selfish gain? Do you think you've won? Do you think this is all just a game to me? Grayson opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was trapped, caught between the man he had tried to be and the truth that had finally caught up with him. For years, he had lived with the belief that he could outsmart everyone. He had used his charm, his arrogance, to manipulate people into believing that he was untouchable. But now, standing in front of our father, the facade was gone. All of it. His smug smile, his confident swagger, it was all gone. And in its place was the realization that nothing he had was truly his. It had been taken, stolen from me, from this family, from everything that my father had worked to build. I gave you everything, Grayson, my father continued, his voice calm but filled with a quiet fury. I worked my entire life to make sure you and Sophie had everything you could ever want. And this is how you repay me? By destroying everything I've built? Grayson's eyes flickered to me, and for the first time, I saw something like fear in his gaze. But it wasn't fear of me. It was fear of the consequences. Fear of what was coming. And Sophie, she wasn't any better. She had always been the one who had slipped under the radar. The one who had stayed in the background, letting Grayson do the dirty work while she enjoyed the benefits. But now, as the truth was revealed, she could no longer hide. She couldn't rely on her charm to get her out of this one. This wasn't something she could talk her way out of. It was too late for that. Grayson's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms as if he were trying to hold on to something, anything, that could save him. But there was nothing. Nothing left to hold on to. My father had made his decision, and that decision was final. You took what wasn't yours, my father said, his voice growing colder with each word. You betrayed your own family. And now, you will face the consequences. It was like watching someone unravel in real time. Grayson, once so confident, so untouchable, was now a man with nothing left. His world was collapsing, and there was no one to help him rebuild it. Sophie, too, was realizing just how far they had fallen. They had been living in a dream, a fantasy world where everything was theirs for the taking. But now that dream was shattered. It was no longer about money, about who would get what. It was about the harsh reality of what they had done, and the price they would have to pay for it. Don't act like you've won, Ethan, Grayson said, his voice low and filled with a bitter edge. He was trying to hold on to something, trying to regain some of the power he had lost. But it wasn't working. His words fell flat, and I could see the panic rising in his eyes. He was grasping at straws, trying to control a situation that was already beyond him. But the harder he tried, the more his world crumbled around him. Sophie's voice broke the silence, but this time, there was no conviction in her tone. You can't do this, she said, her words trembling with fear. You can't just take everything from us. It was a plea, but it was too late. The truth was already out, and no amount of pleading would change the course of what was happening. They were going to lose everything, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Grayson's face twisted with anger, his eyes blazing with frustration. You can't just give it to him, he yelled, his voice shaking with emotion. He doesn't deserve it. The accusation hit me like a physical blow, but I didn't flinch. I didn't need to respond. The facts were already laid out in front of us. Everything he had done, every lie, every betrayal, it was all coming home to roost. My father stood there, unwavering, his gaze fixed on Grayson, his presence calm but commanding. You've lost everything, Grayson, he said, his voice steady. And you have no one to blame but yourself. Grayson's shoulders slumped, the weight of those words finally sinking in. There was no more fight left in him. There was nothing left to say. The truth had won. The tension in the room was unbearable. Every word that came from my father's mouth felt like a final nail being driven into Grayson's carefully constructed world. I had watched for years as he manipulated every situation, playing the part of the perfect son, the one who could do no wrong. He had always been the one with the charm, the looks, the smooth talk that had gotten him everything he wanted. But now, as the truth unraveled before him, I saw the cracks in his facade deepen. The arrogance that had once been his weapon was no longer there. Now, all that was left was a man desperate to save himself, and it was clear he didn't know how. Sophie sat beside him, her eyes darting between my father and Grayson, then to me. The calm confidence she had once exuded was now replaced by a palpable anxiety. It was almost as though the rug had been pulled out from under her too. For so long, she had ridden on Grayson's coattails, benefiting from his manipulation, his control. But now, as everything crumbled around them, she realized the same truth Grayson had just come to terms with. There was no escape. There was no clever way out of this. There was nothing left to do but face the consequences. Grayson finally spoke, his voice shaky, his words tinged with panic. This isn't how it was supposed to go. I have worked for everything. You can't just take everything from me. His voice cracked on the last word, and I could see it in his eyes, the realization that his world, the world he thought he had carefully crafted, was slipping away. For the first time in his life, Grayson was powerless. The lies, the betrayal, the manipulations that had served him so well for so long, they were all meaningless now. My father's quiet but firm words were the truth he could no longer deny. You didn't build anything, Grayson, my father replied, his voice as cold and cutting as ever. You stole it. You took what wasn't yours and ruined everything in the process. The words echoed in the room, and I saw Grayson's face contort with something I hadn't expected to see: regret. It wasn't the kind of regret that came with sincere remorse. No. This was the kind of regret that came from realizing that there was no way out. He had run out of excuses, and the realization that everything he had done was about to fall apart was starting to sink in. Sophie, now looking more desperate than ever, leaned forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "You can't just take it all away from us," she pleaded, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "We've done everything for you. We've been loyal to you." But there was no strength behind her words anymore. There was no confidence, no manipulation, just the raw, desperate attempt to hold on to something she knew was slipping away. The wealth, the lifestyle, everything they had worked so hard to steal was now slipping through their fingers like sand. Grayson shot her a quick glance, but it was clear from the way he held himself that the support he had always relied on was gone. Sophie was no longer the rock he had leaned on. She was just as lost, just as cornered, as he was. For the first time, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. It wasn't the kind of satisfaction that came from revenge or victory. It was the satisfaction of seeing two people who had built their lives on lies finally realize the cost of those lies. They were losing everything, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. My father stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. He reached for the envelope on the table, and the moment he touched it, I could feel the weight of the room shift once again. The entire atmosphere changed, the air thick with anticipation. The moment of truth was upon us. My father held the envelope up in front of us, and his voice rang out, calm but final. "This is where it ends. Everything I've worked for, everything I've sacrificed, will go to someone who understands the value of it. Not to someone who thinks they're entitled to it, just because they've lied and cheated their way through life." Grayson's face turned pale as he took a step back, his eyes flickering from my father to the envelope, then to me. His body was stiff, as if he couldn't process what was happening. As if he still believed that somehow he could talk his way out of this, could twist the situation back to his advantage. But he couldn't. He had no more tricks up his sleeve. The facade was shattered, and nothing remained except the raw, ugly truth. "You think you deserve this?" my father asked, his voice low but filled with disgust. "After everything you've done? After the way you've betrayed your own family, your own blood?" Grayson didn't respond. He couldn't. What could he possibly say to that? He had no defense, no excuses. The years of manipulation, the years of carefully constructed lies, had led him to this moment. And now, there was nothing left for him to do but face it. Sophie's hands were trembling now, her eyes darting between my father and Grayson. She had always been the master of deflection, the queen of using charm and persuasion to get what she wanted. But this time, there was no charm that could fix this. There was no smooth talk that would change the outcome. The truth had been exposed, and nothing they could say or do would change that. As my father spoke, I could feel the anger and frustration of the past 4 years begin to drain out of me. For so long, I had carried the weight of Grayson's betrayal. I had lived with the humiliation, the heartbreak, the sense of loss that had come with it. But now, in this moment, I was finally seeing the reckoning. I was finally witnessing the consequences of his actions, and I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about getting back at him. It was about justice. It was about seeing the truth prevail. "Everything you thought you had is gone," my father said, his voice unwavering. "Everything you thought you deserved, you'll never have. And you have no one to blame but yourselves." Grayson's face was a mixture of disbelief and rage. His fists were clenched at his sides, his knuckles white with the strain. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was too angry, too desperate, to form a coherent thought. He had nothing left to fight with. And that was when I saw it, the realization finally hit him. He had lost. He had lost everything. The wealth, the power, the respect, it was all gone. And there was nothing he could do to get it back. Sophie, too, seemed to come to the same conclusion. Her body went rigid, and her eyes widened with the cold realization that there was no escape. She had ridden Grayson's coattails for so long, had built her life around him and his success, that she hadn't considered what would happen when it all came crashing down. And now, she knew. There was no way out. They had destroyed their lives, and there was no rebuilding them. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of closure. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about coming out on top. It was about watching the truth come to light, about seeing the consequences of their betrayal. And as I watched them both falter, as I watched the life they had built together crumble, I knew that I was free. Free from the anger, free from the bitterness, and free from the past that had haunted me for so long. Finally, after all these years, I could breathe. And I knew, without a doubt, that they could never take anything from me again. The room had never felt more suffocating. The air was thick with tension as my father placed the envelope on the table in front of us. I could feel the weight of it, heavy with the promise of something irreversible. It was almost as if the world had come to a complete halt, and everything we had known for so long was about to be torn apart. Grayson was still standing, his back rigid, his eyes darting from the envelope to my father, and then to me. Sophie had turned pale, her fingers trembling as they clutched the armrests of her chair. For the first time in a long time, she didn't know how to navigate the situation, didn't know how to manipulate the narrative. The truth had settled over them like a blanket of ice, and they were both struggling to keep their composure. I could feel it in their every movement, the desperation to hold on to something that was already slipping away. My father stood there, calm and collected as ever, but I could see the fatigue in his posture. The years of dealing with us, with the betrayal, with the endless manipulation, had taken their toll. His face was set, unflinching. He wasn't just giving us a lecture. He wasn't just talking about money or family legacies. No, this was something far deeper. He was talking about respect, about loyalty, and most of all, he was talking about justice. In his eyes, we had crossed a line, and now it was time to face the consequences. There was no room for excuses, no place for manipulation. The game was over. Grayson, my father said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife, you've always thought you could get away with anything. But I'm done watching you destroy everything I've worked for. His words were measured, each one landing with brutal precision. I could see Grayson's jaw tighten, his face flush with a mixture of anger and panic. For the first time, he was facing a force that couldn't be bent, couldn't be manipulated. It wasn't me, it wasn't Sophie, it was our father. The one person in his life who had never been intimidated, never been swayed by his charm or his lies. And now, that person was standing in front of him, holding the final card. You think you deserve what I've built? My father continued, his tone unwavering. You think because you've been smooth talking your way through life that you're entitled to this? The words hit Grayson like a physical blow. His eyes flickered with something between disbelief and fury. It was a feeling I had been waiting to see on his face for years, the realization that all his efforts, all his scheming, had been for nothing. He wasn't the golden child anymore. He wasn't the one with the power. The illusion of control had been shattered, and now he was left standing in the ruins of his own making. Sophie, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. This isn't fair, she said, her voice shaky. She was grasping at the remnants of her confidence, trying to find the words that would bring everything back to how it was. You can't just take it all away from us. We've been loyal, we've worked hard, we've done everything you wanted. But there was no fire in her voice, no conviction. It was a hollow plea, an attempt to regain some control, but it was too late. My father's words had already sealed their fate. You don't know what loyalty is, my father shot back. Loyalty isn't about taking what doesn't belong to you. It's about respect. It's about honor. His gaze shifted to Grayson, then to Sophie, and I could see the finality in his eyes. They had lost. Not just the battle, but everything they had worked so hard to steal. Sophie's face grew tighter, the panic rising as she realized the truth in my father's words. There was no way out for them. No lawyer would be able to save them now. The truth was out, and nothing could undo what had been done. They were going to lose everything, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Dad, please, Grayson said, his voice now strained. You don't have to do this. I'm sorry. I was wrong. His words faltered, and for the first time in years, I saw him flounder. There was no confidence left in his voice, no manipulation in his eyes. He was a man caught in the web he had spun for himself, and he was realizing, too late, that he couldn't talk his way out of this one. Sophie looked at him, but even she didn't know what to say. The woman who had been so sure of herself, the one who had always been able to twist situations in her favor, was now speechless, her face drained of color. They were both drowning, and there was no lifeline left. Don't talk to me about sorry, my father replied, his voice hard as steel. Sorry doesn't undo the damage. Sorry doesn't fix the betrayal. Sorry doesn't bring back what you've taken from this family. You've been playing this game for years, Grayson, but it's over now. You've lost. The finality in his voice was deafening. Grayson's face contorted with rage, but there was no heat in it. It was empty, a reaction born of desperation rather than power. He was broken, and he knew it. Sophie's voice wavered again, but this time, there was no attempt to defend herself. There was no more manipulation, no more arguments. There was only the cold, hard truth of what had happened. My father reached for the envelope once again, and opened it slowly. The room seemed to hold its breath as he pulled out the documents inside. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. This was the moment when everything changed. My father's words were sharp and deliberate as he set the papers down on the table. "This is my will," he said, his voice steady. "And it will not be changed. Everything I've worked for, everything I've sacrificed, will be passed on to someone who understands what it means to be part of this family. Not someone who's used it for their own gain. Not someone who's taken what wasn't theirs." Grayson stared at the papers in front of him, his face ashen. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, and I could see the panic in her eyes. They knew what was coming. They knew this was the end of their story. The life they had built, the life they had stolen, was about to come crashing down. And this time, there was no way out. "You've lost everything," my father said, his voice now quiet but filled with authority. "And there's nothing you can do to change it." The words lingered in the air, each one sealing their fate. Grayson stood frozen, his body tense, his eyes locked on the envelope, unable to look away from the reality that had just been handed to him. Sophie's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw the mask of arrogance fall away. She, too, had lost. And there was nothing left for them but the consequences of their actions. The world they had carefully constructed, the lies they had lived, were now exposed. And they would never get them back. The tension in the room was palpable, every second dragging on like an eternity. My father's words had landed like a heavy punch, each one carving through the air. And the aftermath felt like a storm settling into the calm, before the real chaos began. Grayson stood there, frozen for a moment, still trying to process what had just happened, as though he hadn't fully grasped that his entire world was crashing down around him. I could see it in his eyes, those familiar eyes that used to gleam with confidence. Arrogance even, now filled with something I hadn't seen before, pure panic. Sophie, beside him, wasn't any better. Her usual poised demeanor had cracked, her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of her chair. They were both broken in a way they had never been before. The illusion of control they had so carefully maintained for years had vanished. And now, they were forced to confront the reality they had so desperately tried to avoid. My father, standing tall in the midst of it all, was unshaken. There was no sign of the anger I had expected to see in his eyes. Instead, there was just a cold, unwavering resolve. It was as if everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, had led to this very moment. He had already made his choice. And now, it was time for the rest of us to accept it. There was no turning back. The documents on the table, the will had sealed their fate. They weren't just words on paper. They were a statement, a declaration that everything had been decided. The game was over. Grayson's eyes flicked from the envelope to my father, back to the papers. His face, usually so confident, had turned pale. The arrogance, that smug superiority, was gone. In its place was a look of someone realizing they had lost everything. And worse than losing it was the realization that it was entirely his fault. "Do you still think you have any claim to this?" My father's voice broke through the thick silence, his tone as cold as steel. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His presence alone commanded attention. And every word he spoke was like a hammer, bringing down the weight of his decision on Grayson and Sophie's heads. Grayson flinched, the smallest of movements, but it was enough to show just how rattled he had become. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some defense, but the words didn't come. His face twisted in frustration, the realization that he had no more cards to play finally settling in. Sophie's gaze was fixed on my father, then back to Grayson, her lips pressed into a tight line. She had no more tricks left either. She had ridden on Grayson's coattails for far too long, relying on his manipulation and the power he had accumulated. But now that power was gone, and with it, the carefully constructed world they had built. "You've lost everything," my father continued, his voice quiet but filled with an undeniable strength. "And not just money, not just the assets. You've lost the trust, the respect, the very foundation of this family. You've destroyed it all with your greed. Grayson's face contorted with anger at the accusation, but there was no fire behind it anymore. The anger was empty, hollow. It was the kind of anger that comes from helplessness, from a person realizing they have nothing left. He opened his mouth again, his voice shaky, but my father didn't give him a chance to speak. He had already said it all. Grayson's time was up. Sophie looked at him now, a small crack in her perfect exterior. Her eyes flickered with doubt, and I could see the beginnings of fear crawling into her gaze. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected the situation to get so out of hand, to go so far beyond her control. For all the years she had spent manipulating the people around her, for all the ways she had used Grayson to get what she wanted, it was now coming back to her. The house of cards was crumbling, and no amount of pleading or sweet talking would save her now. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible, laced with desperation. "You can't just take it all away from us. We've worked for it." Her voice cracked at the end, a tiny but significant sign that the facade was slipping. But my father's response was immediate, unflinching. "You didn't work for anything. You took it. And now, you'll see what happens when you try to steal from your own family. No amount of loyalty can cover up your betrayal." Sophie went silent, the color draining from her face as she realized there was no more room for negotiation, no more space to weave her way out of this. The truth was out, laid bare for all to see. And there was nothing left to hide behind. Grayson tried once more, his voice trembling with something that could only be described as a last-ditch effort to salvage some dignity. But it fell flat. "This isn't how it was supposed to go," he snapped, his eyes wide, frantic. "I didn't mean for it to end like this. Please. You have to understand." His voice faltered, his eyes searching for some kind of sympathy, some way out. But no one was there to offer him any. Not my father, not me. No one. My father's gaze was steady, unwavering. There was no pity, no sympathy in his eyes, only cold, hard resolve. "You've already made your choices," my father said, his voice growing softer now, but no less powerful. "And now you will live with the consequences. All of you." The finality of his words hung in the air like a thick fog. Grayson's shoulders slumped. For the first time in as long as I could remember, he wasn't the one in control. He wasn't the one calling the shots. His world was crumbling, piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Sophie shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation. "What do you expect us to do?" she asked, her voice breaking. There was no arrogance in it now, no confidence. There was only a raw, exposed woman who had miscalculated everything, who had thought she could manipulate her way out of anything, but who now saw the full extent of the consequences. "I expect you to accept what you've done," my father replied, his voice low, but clear, "and live with the fact that you can't undo the damage you've caused. You can't erase the choices you've made." Grayson's eyes flickered to me, the old resentment still burning there, but even that was tinged with something new: defeat. The truth had crushed him, and he knew there was no way out. My father turned to me, his expression softening for the first time since this whole ordeal had started. "You've been through enough," he said simply. His voice was calm, filled with a quiet understanding. For a moment, everything else faded away: the years of hurt, the betrayal, the pain that had followed me through the darkness. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. I looked at Grayson and Sophie, watching them struggle to comprehend the magnitude of what had just transpired. There was no coming back from this. And as I watched them slowly crumble under the weight of their actions, I realized I was finally free. Free from the past. Free from the anger. For the first time, I wasn't bound by what they had taken from me. I was free to move on. And nothing could take that away from me. The silence that followed felt almost oppressive. Grayson and Sophie were left standing at the center of the storm they had created, their world crumbling around them. My father's will had been read, and the choices had been made. There was no turning back, no way to undo what had been done. For so long, I had lived with the bitterness of their betrayal, with the sting of their lies and manipulations. But now, with everything laid bare, I could finally feel the weight of it lifting. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about justice. It was about seeing the consequences of their actions catch up with them. As I looked at Grayson, still frozen in place, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. I felt something unexpected, relief. For years, I had wondered if this day would ever come, if they would ever face what they had done. Now that it had arrived, it wasn't the feeling of triumph I had once imagined. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction, a peace that came from knowing I was finally free. The past was behind me, and whatever future lay ahead, I would face it with a sense of calm I had never thought possible. Grayson's eyes flickered toward me again, but this time, I saw no hint of the old resentment. There was no fire, no arrogance, just defeat. His shoulders sagged, and I could see how much of him was slowly unraveling. For the first time in years, I didn't have to wonder what he was thinking or feeling. It was all out in the open now. The truth had exposed him for what he truly was, a man who had lived in the shadows of his lies. And now that the light had been shined on him, there was nowhere left to hide. Sophie, too, was visibly shaken. Her posture had always been so composed, so confident. But now, she was broken. The woman who had once manipulated every situation to her advantage, who had used her charm to worm her way into every corner of my life, was sitting there, completely vulnerable. The reality was sinking in, and I could see it in the way she avoided eye contact, the way her hands fidgeted in her lap. She was no longer the woman who had taken what wasn't hers. Now, she was just another casualty of their betrayal. My father, standing tall as ever, looked at me for a moment, his gaze softening just slightly. I could see the weariness in his face, the toll this had all taken on him. The last few months had been hard on him, much harder than I had ever imagined. But in that moment, I saw something else in him too. There was a quiet strength, a sense of satisfaction that only comes with the knowledge that you've done the right thing, that you've stood firm and unwavering in the face of betrayal. He had made his choice, and now, as he looked at me, I could see that he was proud, not just of what he had built, but of the way he had protected this family, of the way he had finally taken control of his own destiny. "Everything's done," my father said, his voice low but strong. "It's over. No more lies, no more deceit. It's time for all of us to move on." His words struck me harder than I had anticipated. For so long, I had been trapped in the web of Grayson and Sophie's actions. I had lived in the shadows of their betrayal, wondering if I would ever escape the grip they had on me. But now, I was free. And it wasn't just the sense of justice that washed over me. It was the realization that I could finally let go. I could finally stop living in the past. I could stop carrying the weight of their choices on my shoulders. It was their burden now, not mine. Grayson's head hung low, his eyes staring at the ground as if the weight of it all had become too much to bear. Sophie's gaze was fixed on him, but there was no support there anymore. She was as lost as he was, her face a mixture of disbelief and regret. They had built their empire on lies, on manipulation, and now it was all coming crashing down. And the worst part was, they had no one to blame but themselves. They had made the choices that led them here. They had betrayed my trust, my love. And now they were paying the price. It was strange, this sense of satisfaction that I was feeling. It wasn't the kind of victory I had imagined in my darker moments. There was no joy in their downfall, no celebration in their misery. There was just a quiet, profound relief. I had spent so long wondering when this day would come, and now that it was here, I realized it wasn't about winning. It wasn't about coming out on top. It was about knowing that justice had been served, that the truth had been heard, and that I could finally begin to rebuild my life. The silence in the room stretched on, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Grayson and Sophie sat there, still processing everything, while my father and I exchanged a quiet understanding. We had both been through the fire, had both faced the pain of betrayal, and now, we were both moving on. They had tried to tear us apart, to take everything from us. But in the end, it was their own actions that had led to their undoing. And there was no turning back. "I'll give you time," my father said, his voice calm but firm. "But don't think this changes anything. You've lost everything. And now, you have to live with the consequences." He paused, and his gaze settled on Grayson and Sophie, as though he was allowing them one last moment to come to terms with what had just happened. And that's something no amount of money or power can change. It was a final blow, a harsh reality that they had no choice but to face. The life they had known, the life they had fought so hard to maintain, was gone. My father wasn't just speaking about the wealth they had stolen, but the trust and respect they had lost. They had burned every bridge, and now, there was no way to rebuild it. No apologies, no explanations would ever change that. As I watched them, I realized that it didn't matter anymore. The anger, the hurt, the resentment, they were all things of the past. They had no hold over me anymore. I had won, but winning didn't mean making them suffer. It didn't mean taking pleasure in their downfall. Winning meant walking away from the past, moving on from the pain, and finding a future that was truly my own. Grayson stood slowly, his body stiff and tense. But there was no more fight left in him. Sophie followed suit, her face drawn, her eyes empty. They walked out of the room, no words exchanged, no final attempt to manipulate or plead for mercy. The door closed behind them with a finality that left no room for doubt. It was over. I sat down, letting the weight of everything settle over me. The past was behind me now. I could feel the bitterness, the anger, slowly melting away. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. I wasn't living in someone else's shadow anymore. I was free. My father sat across from me, watching me with an expression that said it all. We had both endured the same storm, but now, we were both standing firm on the other side of it. And for the first time, we could look forward, not backward. "You did well," my father said simply, his voice softening as he looked at me. And in that moment, I knew he was right. It was over. They had lost. And I was free. Did you see that coming? Did Grayson and Sophie really think they could get away with everything? The consequences were inevitable. But who truly lost in the end? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Who do you think got the biggest shock? The story reminds us that no one is above the consequences of their actions. In life, deceit, betrayal, and manipulation may seem like shortcuts to success, but they come at a steep price. Trust and integrity are priceless, and once broken, they are almost impossible to rebuild. This serves as a powerful lesson. No matter how much power or wealth one accumulates, it means nothing without honor and respect. In the end, living with integrity and taking responsibility for your choices is the only way to find true peace and success. It's a lesson we must all apply in our lives.